You're listening to the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Hey everybody, this is Jason with Curious About Cannabis. Thanks so much for tuning in once again. So today marks a really big moment for the podcast in that we are on our 50th behind the scenes episode. Really, we've done more than 50 episodes because we have about 10 seasonal episodes on top of the behind the scenes episodes. So we've really done about 60, but we've hit the halfway point to 100 as far as our interviews go and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to do something a little special for the 50th episode. So what I wanted to do today is it's for the most part just going to be you and me together here by ourselves. But earlier last year, I talked to the Godfather of cannabis science, Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, via email. And we had a nice exchange, and he answered a variety of questions I had, and he expressed interest in coming on the podcast, but due to series of different medical issues and things like that, we never were able to quite work out an appearance on the podcast. But through our email exchanges, there was a lot of great information that was shared that I thought would be pretty cool to share with you, and sort of be the closest thing that we could get to having Dr. Mechoulam on the podcast itself. And in doing so, we can kind of celebrate, the fact that we've made it halfway to 100 episodes. And there's also an accompanying 3-hour celebration episode that will go with this that is available on our Patreon at patreon.com/curiousaboutcannabis. And in that episode, I'm joined with Higher Peaks from Oregon Rooted. It's another local podcast based out of Southern Oregon. We kind of got started around the same time. How I got started doing podcasting was appearing on his podcast, and then he ended up helping me out and teaching me what I needed to do to get my podcast going. So it seemed fitting that we get together and do a celebratory episode for the 50th behind the scenes episode. So we got together and just kind of celebrated, kicked back, and reflected on things, how things have gotten to where they are and where they're going. It was really, really fun. It went about 3 hours long. And if you're interested in checking that out, go to our Patreon. It's a great episode if you're wanting to kind of learn more about me personally, and some of the work that I've done and where I've come from and my own relationship with cannabis, that sort of thing. That's a good episode to check out there. And we'll include a little clip of it at the end of this episode. But for our public podcast feed, I wanted to just kind of, I guess in some ways, kind of channel Dr. Mechoulam here and share with you some of the things that we talked about and see what we learned from it. So without further ado, let's jump in here. So one of the first things that we talked about is I asked him what we might be able to expect from the future of cannabis and cannabinoid research over the next 10 or 20 years. And one of the things that he said was that he expects that we'll learn a lot more about our physiology, but also our psychology. And particularly, he mentions molecular psychology. So, what are the molecules that are involved in building up our personalities and psychological traits and behaviors? And then he said that he believes that we'll have numerous new cannabinoid drugs because of the remarkable toxicity profile of cannabinoids, the fact that they're so generally non-toxic. He believes that we'll see quite a lot of cannabinoid drugs be developed in the near future. And he also said that he presumes that the activity of a lot of the anandamide-like compounds in the body will be better understood. So in general, what he's referring to here are what are called endocannabinoid congeners, compounds that are very similar to endocannabinoids. Oftentimes they may not have much activity at cannabinoid receptors, but they may have a lot of activity at vanilloid receptors or nuclear receptors and things that influence cannabinoid receptors. And there are tons of these, and I really recommend, if you haven't yet, go listen to my episode with Dr. Vincenzo DiMarzo, who worked with Dr. Mechoulam to try to understand the endocannabinoid system. And in that episode, he really describes just how complex the concept of the endocannabinoid system has gotten, and he talks about this concept of endocannabinoid congeners and kind of what we can think about those for the future. Very, very interesting stuff. And Dr. Mechoulam actually mentions the concept of endocannabinoids teaching us about molecular psychology multiple times throughout our conversation here. So I just kind of want to put a pin on that we'll come back to that note. But to summarize, what can we expect to see from the future of cannabis and cannabinoid research over the next 10 or 20 years? Get a much better understanding of how our bodies work, get a better understanding of how our minds work. We'll see an outpouring of new cannabinoid-based drugs as a less toxic alternative to a lot of other pre-existing pharmaceuticals. And we will start to understand what a lot of these endocannabinoid congeners are doing in the body, which is presumably then going to lead to more drug development and even better understandings of our physiology, and not just the endocannabinoid system, but the endocannabinoidome. The next thing that we talked about is I asked him at what moment in his career did he begin to really understand the therapeutic significance of the work that he was doing with cannabinoids. And he mentioned that this realization really sank in for him sometime in the late 1970s. And he said particularly what he thinks about is work that he was doing with the late Dr. Carlini in Sao Paulo in the late 1970s, when they discovered that CBD was a really good anti-epileptic drug. And it was in that moment of recognizing that the non-intoxicating components of cannabis had such strong therapeutic effects that he really began to understand that all of this research with cannabinoids was going to lead to something much bigger than he anticipated. And so that was really fascinating, and I hope to follow up with him about that and talk to him more about that period of time in the 1970s and kind of what that was like. Because the 1970s is an interesting time where, in the mid-1960s is when Mechoulam's team published information basically highlighting that THC was the intoxicating component of cannabis. And you start to see a lot of THC research take off then. And it really wasn't until the late 70s and 80s that you start to see this CBD research start to really come about, as researchers wanted to understand what the potential applications of the non-intoxicating components of cannabis might be. And there had already been a little bit of research on CBD before this point, even going as far back as really the early 20th century, the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. There was CBD research going on then. But the 1970s, we start to see a resurgence of CBD research that's kind of confirming some old findings and then starting to take the science further and try to understand how CBD works in comparison to THC. So that's a nice, cool little snapshot of history there. The next question I asked him was, what was the most surprising or counterintuitive thing that he learned in all of his years studying cannabis and cannabinoids? And this might have been surprising to me several years ago, but now I don't find it too surprising. But he said, when you're on to something totally new, the scientific administrators and many colleagues may say that that's not true, or your data should not be supported. Basically kind of trying to deny the new narrative that's being put together by the data you're presenting. And this is something we all struggle with, right? That when we kind of have our body of information that we've learned and the way we understand things to work, when something comes along that kind of bucks against that, it's uncomfortable, and we tend to resist accepting it until we don't have a choice anymore. And so Dr. Mechoulam was just sharing that it didn't necessarily expect that kind of response from especially the scientific community that in general should be open to new ideas, new information, that sort of thing. And maybe he kind of underestimated how resistant people would be to accepting what he had to share. The next question that I asked him was, what areas of current cannabis and cannabinoid research do you find the most interesting, and why? And he said primarily he's really focused on understanding what all of these anandamide-like compounds are doing in the body, these endocannabinoid congeners, and what we're coming to understand as novel endocannabinoids, these omega-3 fatty acid derived endocannabinoids and other omega-6 fatty acid derived endocannabinoids. There's a lot more to the endocannabinoid system than anandamide and 2-AG. And what he pointed out in our conversation about this is he said that we've already seen that arachidonylserine is a vasodilator and can maybe reduce brain damage, especially in situations like concussions, traumatic brain injuries, that sort of thing. He mentioned that oleoserine is an anti-osteoporotic, so possibly influencing bone health and that sort of thing. And then he mentioned that oleoglycine is an anti-nicotine agent, that it could possibly help with addiction, that it can block both nicotine and opioid withdrawal, and that research for all of these things that he's mentioning are all published. And so it's, really more a question of how do we push forward on clinical work to try to understand how to best take advantage of these activities. And that's just, a few of these novel anandamide-like compounds, and there are a lot more. So we're really just scratching the surface here, but that was the main thing that he focused on, is just trying to understand all of these nuanced activities that are influencing the endocannabinoid system and expanding our focus well beyond 2-AG, anandamide, THC, CBD. The picture is so much more complicated. The next question I asked was, what are two or three common misunderstandings about cannabis and cannabinoids that you frequently encounter? And he mentioned two things. One is that he still runs into the idea that cannabis is as addictive as opioids are, when in reality, according to most of the published literature, it seems like, addiction in cannabis use, maybe is something that 10% of users at most deal with. And really, addiction may not even be the best word, because there are different types of addiction, different types of dependence would really be maybe a better term. And the rate of cannabis addiction, that 9-10% that often gets quoted, is about equal to what you would expect in something like shopping addiction, or an addiction to working out, or an eating disorder, that sort of thing, gambling addiction. And these are behavioral addictions more so than like chemical addictions to, like you would see in nicotine for cigarette smoking, or with opioids, or cocaine, other drugs of abuse like that. And so certainly cannabis is not as addictive as alcohol, opioids, all of that sort of thing, but you can be addicted to just about any behavior. And we do see that in, usually the number I see is 9%. He mentions 10% here of the addiction rates associated with cannabis. It is something that people do sometimes have trouble discontinuing their use, and if their use is causing them to forego responsibilities and obligations that they care about, and that they're preoccupied when they don't want to be with thinking about using, and working with things that remind them of using, and they want to stop that behavior and they can't, that's problematic, and that is a real thing for some people. The good thing is that cannabis's withdrawal effects are relatively mild compared to most substances of abuse. So discontinuing use is not life-threatening or anything like that. It can cause sleep disorders, depression, disruption to appetite. Those are some of the most common withdrawal symptoms. And then he said he also still runs into the idea that cannabis causes brain damage, which he points out it does not. And that's one that I still run into as well sometimes. And a lot of times when people are saying that cannabis causes brain damage, they're uh, sort of disingenuously misrepresenting some of the research. Because there is some research that shows that chronic cannabis use or chronic CB1 receptor activation can lead to changes in the brain. It changes the way the brain functions. It changes some of the structures in the brain. Now, saying that something causes changes to a brain is different than saying that something causes brain damage, which implies that the changes are leading to some malfunctioning of the brain. Now, one of the main areas where this sort of more straightforward is in the context of memory. Long-term cannabis use can cause changes to the hippocampus and alter the way that the brain recalls memories. Now, so far, all of the negative effects of cannabis, like some of these brain changes and everything, as far as we can tell, seem to be reversible. Some of the research on that is really hard to do to the level that we would like to see it. But most of what's been studied shows that a lot of these effects are reversible, and that certainly long-term cannabis users, there are many, many people that are very, very intelligent that continue to use cannabis frequently. And cannabis certainly doesn't cause like brain atrophy, which is really what I start to think about when I think about real brain damage, like actual reduction of brain mass and sort of brain atrophying, which then leads to all sorts of other problems. It could be life-threatening. No, cannabis does not do that at all. Next question that I asked him, this was one I was really interested to get his response for. In your years observing the behaviors of different cannabinoids, are you able to predict a compound's activity at a cannabinoid receptor or a vanilloid receptor, etc., based on its molecular characteristics? And if so, what kinds of patterns have you noticed? And one thing he said is that he's noticed that cannabinoids that have 3 completed rings in their molecular structure, which would be called a tricyclic cannabinoid, 3 circles, tricyclic, that they tend to be THC-like. They tend to have activity at CB1 receptors, whereas cannabinoids that only have 2 complete rings, or are otherwise known as bicyclic, like CBD, tend to have more activity at vanilloid receptors, like TRPV1 receptors. And in general, these cannabinoids tend to not have much affinity at all for traditional cannabinoid receptors. Now, something we didn't talk about at the time that I wish we would have, and I ought to follow up with him and ask about this, is what about monocyclic cannabinoids like CBG? That's one of the more interesting things, I think, about comparing THC, CBD, and CBG is that THC is tricyclic, CBD is bicyclic, and CBG is monocyclic. And you would expect that that would have some substantial impacts in their pharmacology, how they interact with the body. But in general, Dr. Mechoulam focused on this idea that you can often predict to some degree the activity of a cannabinoid based on the number of completed rings in the molecular structure. If you've got 3 rings, it's usually THC-like, and you can look up a lot of synthetic THC-like molecules. A lot of the synthetic cannabinoids that were put into products like Spice and K2, these synthetic CB1 agonists, a lot of times they have 3 molecular rings or more. And then this idea that bicyclic cannabinoids tend to act more like vanilloids. Very interesting. The next thing I asked him is, how do you personally conceptualized the endocannabinoid system and the endocannabinoidome. And he said to him, they are definitely major new biological systems, just as significant as the dopaminergic and serotonergic systems in the body, which I definitely agree with. And ultimately, he highlights that the endocannabinoid system is part of this series of interconnected systems. And, we're still trying to wrap our heads around how these systems function independently and in concert with each other, which makes them ever more complicated to study and more exciting. And I asked him, how do you hope to see endocannabinoid system research impact medicine in the future? And he said, primarily going back to his responses to the first question, he hopes to see that ECS research is going to lead to safer medicines, broader options of medicines that are available, cannabinoid medicines that are less toxic and less damaging to the human body. And then finally, I asked him, what do you most hope people will understand and take away from your work? And he said he assumes that most scientists will understand why the things that he's mentioned so far are important, why understanding the activity of anandamide-like compounds is important, and why, um, getting a better understanding of the endocannabinoid system is going to lead to safer drugs and that sort of thing. But he said beyond that, he also hopes that people start to understand the role that the endocannabinoid system plays in the variability of personality and of individual emotions. And if you stop and think about it, this really makes sense. It's obvious that cannabinoids affect personality and our emotions and everything. I mean, just look at what THC does to people. Um, Certainly has a strong effect on the psyche. But it also kind of opens up this doorway to try and understand what these endogenous compounds in the body are doing to lead to these patterns of behavior, patterns of thoughts and feelings that we tend to associate with our personalities and with our psyches. And especially when you start to think about how interconnected the endocannabinoid system is with the serotonergic system, for instance, that a lot of times you see serotonin receptors and cannabinoid receptors paired up together as heteromers. And so the activity at one is affecting the activity at the other and vice versa. And we know through psychedelic research that serotonin in the serotonergic system is a huge part of building our experience of the world and contributing to all sorts of characteristics of consciousness and things. And so if it's, really woven together with the endocannabinoid system, then it follows and makes perfect sense that the endocannabinoid system would be a huge part of the um, molecular machinery underneath our psychology. So super, super fascinating stuff. That's the majority of what we talked about. I do plan on reaching out to him again and asking some more questions. I was really stoked to see that he managed to see my podcast appearance on Brave New Weed recently, talking about Delta 8 THC. I was very, very pleased that somehow that episode made it to him. Maybe he'll end up catching this episode of Curious About Cannabis. Um, but that's about all I have to give you from Dr. Mechoulam himself right now. If you have questions that you'd like me to ask Dr. Mechoulam, feel free to send them, and I'm happy to reach out to him again and ask some questions and see if he responds. He was very, very polite and nice when I reached out to him before, so I would expect he'll probably, as long as he's got the time and energy to do it, he'll probably be happy to answer more questions. So anyways, with that, that's my little special treat here for our 50th episode. The next thing that I'll give you here is we'll transition into a little clip from our 3-hour celebration episode that's available on Patreon. And just to remind you, you can find that episode at patreon.com/curiousaboutcannabis. And go check it out and celebrate with us and hang out with us. And we'll be back next week with a normal behind the scenes interview episode. We're going to be bringing you an episode with Alicia Ratliff talking all about issues around scaling extraction facilities and trying to do it in a sustainable manner. We also have an episode coming up with Bryant Mason of Soil Doctor Consulting. We're going to talk all about soil science. We've got quite a few other interviews that are in the works that are coming down the pipeline that I'll be announcing really soon that I'm excited to share with you all. So thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this little clip from the 3-hour celebration. Check out our Patreon to listen to the whole thing, and I'll catch you guys next week. Stay curious and take it easy. And so during Katrina, because we had other family living with us, I was tucked away on this little like army cot in my dad's office with, basically just didn't have a room anymore or really any space. So the space I carved out for myself was in my mind. And so I spent a lot of time listening to music, and particularly listening to albums that I could, get an experience out of, that were purposefully made as concept albums and things to really, change your consciousness. And so it was around that time that's when I decided I wanted to try cannabis, because then I was like, I want to understand what that experience is like, and how it, obviously all of these people that I respect as musicians and stuff have experimented with these things. So what's that about? So 16, 17, to try that. I remember I was at a high school football game, and my friend comes to me. He's like, "Hey, dude, you want to get stoned?" And I was like, "Yes, I do. I do want to get stoned.
Yes,
I would like to get stoned." And so
and that's okay.
Yeah. At that point, I'd grown out of the anti-drug thing, had become super hippie, and a total transformation. And that was, like I said, before any substance use was involved. And a lot of people at my high school thought that I was doing psychedelics and using cannabis and stuff like way before I ever did.
Crazy.
Just because
of what you were doing.
What I was doing. Yeah, I was just into all of that kind of stuff, and that's where my mind was at. So yeah, we disappeared, go have a bonfire.
Nice. And, oh, beautiful.
Yeah, man. And just
great experience.
Yeah, just sat around this bonfire and smoked, 2 bowls, I think. And
that's tough for a beginner.
Yeah, but this is like
brick weed.
The shittiest of shitty weed.
We're talking like that tire weed.
I mean, like really, like it always smells like coffee because it's been stored in coffee grounds. And, you see the brick, like corners in your bag. And
we call it the brown frown because it was just like, sometimes you're just like,
Yeah, but that's what we had. And I mean, I definitely experienced something then, but I had no context to put it in. And so, I got high, but I couldn't. It was way different than what I experience now, just because I had no frame of reference. And my brain was sort of like, I don't know what to do with this. But then I used cannabis then that one time, and then maybe one time a year later. And then I was like, okay, that was interesting. And then that was just sort of on pause for a while, where I was like really more interested in psychedelics. I found psychedelics to be much more interesting and had like more that I maybe had more to gain from them. So I just sort of put cannabis in my mind on a shelf. And
well, you just had edibles yet, man.
Right. Yeah.
That can be
psychedelic for sure.
Wow. You just got to be careful with that. But I got 2 questions for you. First of all, I want you to tell me, how do you use it as medicine? How does it work for you to make you feel better? And I just got to say this before you answer this question, is that Organ Rooted is all about psychoactives. I mean, caffeine, there's so much stuff out there.
Yeah.
And we manipulate our bodies and our minds with this stuff. And we've had a relationship with this stuff since the beginning of whenever. And I believe, just an opinion, that it's had an effect on our evolution. So I really think that as long as you have a good relationship with whatever it is, that it can be beneficial. But I do want to know how it does work for you. And then also, can we get into psychoactives?
Yeah,
Or, I mean, not
definitely.
psychoactives, but psychedelics?
Yeah, I
Oh,
mean,
perfect.
so this will all segue really
Okay.
well, because like I said, I kind of put cannabis on a shelf, and when I came back to it, it certainly wasn't purely therapeutic. There was a very large recreational aspect involved once I was in college and everything. But also, when I was in college, is when I started to understand that I had some mental health issues. Also, when I was a teenager, I was a skateboarder. I thrashed my back
Ooh.
multiple, like I slammed my spine on a rail like
It's a
multiple
tough sport.
times.
It's a tough sport.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I cracked my tailbone. I wouldn't go to the doctor. So, like, every
Couldn't
time
sit down for 6 months.
it was one of the worst pains. Like, there was no position you could get in. Definitely
Yeah.
couldn't sit down or lay
Yep.
down.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, I was very stubborn. I wouldn't go to the doctor. I would just kind of get through it. So I didn't ever get scans or anything done on any of that. I have a scar I can actually show you on my leg where one time, so my friends, they tended to like get their parents to, like, make them ramps, that we would skate on. And so one of my friends had this quarter pipe in his front yard, and it was really really fun, but it didn't have so many safety features. And so at one point, I kind of hit it a little too fast, and I flew past the coping off the ramp and kind of spun around. And when I came down, my leg just grinded against the corner of the wood on the other side of the ramp, and it just shaved my leg. Like, it's
Ooh.
flat. Like, you can
Ugh.
look at it now,
Took
and it's
some
just,
took some meat.
yes, it was very. That's another one of, like, the worst pains I've ever felt. So I thrashed my body a lot in my teenage years as a skateboarder. I was also one of those that was jumping off of rooftops, and we'd skate off of rooftops, jump into pools. That same friend that had that quarter pipe, he had a 6 foot half pipe in his backyard, and so doing ridiculous stuff that
Hmm.
we had no conception that there would be lifelong consequences for.
You
Um,
don't in your 20s.
no, and so when I'm in college, I'm starting to realize that, like, I fucked up a little bit. Like,
Yeah.
my back really hurts, and
Yeah.
also, like, I'm getting super super depressed and occasionally doing kind of crazy things, and I
Right.
don't know why. And so in my early 20s is when I'm starting to go to therapy, starting to finally, like, go see doctors, and finally get MRIs on my back, and they're like, "Hey, do you know you have cysts all along your spine? And by
Ooh.
the way, you've got 3 bulging discs, and
Oh man.
all these different things." And, like, also, you're like 22, and we don't want to do surgery on you because that might make it worse.
Yeah.
And so, I ended up going through a series of drug trials, and some of my closest friends don't even know about this because it was just what I was doing in my personal life, and I didn't really talk about it that much at the time. I felt a little weird about it, but um, I got put on steroids for a while to see how that would affect the back pain. I got put on antidepressants for a while. I got put on
All that stuff it's just crazy. Like it can change you. Like
substantially, yeah.
steroids. Whew.
Yeah, I mean, the steroids thing, looking back on it, I'm just like, I don't understand what the point was. I'm sure it was an investigatory thing of, like,
Yeah.
trying to see, okay, based on how he reacts, we'll have some better sense of what's going on. But I mean, I went through the ringer, all sorts of different drugs that I was put on. Luckily, my doctor would never put me on opiates, because there was some awareness at that time among
Depends
better
on the
better
doctor.
doctors. Yeah,
Well, it
that
depends on the
that's
doctor. Some
mhm.
doctors will just slang pills all day.
Right. Yeah. And luckily, this wasn't one of them. Otherwise, I probably would have gotten addicted to
Hmm.
opiates and had that whole pathway. But we finally kind of realized that a lot of the drugs I was trying were not going to help my back, and that surgery was going to be a gamble. But if I increased my movement, hiked more, and then I figured out if I used cannabis regularly, then my back spasms would stop,
Hmm.
and everything would relax enough that I would go through my days not thinking so much about the pain.
Right.
And it would also make the moments where I'm like going on these hikes and everything easier. And so it created basically a feedback loop that
Hmm.
was really, really helpful. Simultaneously, I'm going through therapy trying to figure out what's going on with my mind and realizing that like, oh, I might be bipolar, and then there might be a little PTSD mixed in there, and maybe some ADHD, or
Hmm.
not ADHD, but ADD mixed in there, which
Okay.
bipolar and ADD often appear together
Sure.
anyway. But so I'm wrestling with all of that, and then realizing that, and I don't recommend this to people, but for me, my personal story, I found that cannabis helped balance the mental health stuff too. Like it provided a consistent um, frame of consciousness that was reliable, that I could
Hmm.
always go to. That if I was slipping into a deep depression or getting into a manic state, that once again, this isn't true for everyone, but for me, it brought me back to some, consistent,
Homeostasis.
yeah. And so it just started to piece that together. And, in my mid 20s, came out of the other side with, getting to what you're kind of talking about, this matured relationship with cannabis, that,
Hmm.
figuring out how it helped, how it didn't help. This is when I started to realize, like, okay, I need to use cannabis really just at night,
Hmm.
so that I'll still get the benefits the next day,
Right.
but I won't be foggy, or I'll be able to perform better because so much of my work is about my mind. And
Absolutely.
and so that all really comes together, and I start to figure out what my relationship with cannabis really looks like. And then up to more modern days, thinking about, okay, I'm about to have a kid, like, how do I communicate my relationship with cannabis to
Right.
my kid?
That's tough. That's
um
tough.
and
Especially with society,
yes, I mean, it's harder because of just the
the construct. Yeah.
the outward pressure and perceptions. If it were just you and your family, like, it wouldn't be that
Well,
stressful.
and we've talked about this, Jason. It's education.
Hmm.
You're not. It's all about education, and like it's funny that you can go to a barbecue and everybody can have a beer,
Yeah,
and then you smoke a bowl, and all
all
of
of
a
a
sudden
sudden.
it's like, oh, you're a drug addict or something. I've always wondered about that, and I'm like, so what society deems okay and not okay really is crazy. I don't.
It's absolutely crazy, and that's something that has really affected my outlook on the world quite a bit, because I once I recognized that this was going to be a permanent part of my life, that, like, I'm probably going to be using cannabis in some form till the day I die,
Yeah.
because right now, until there are medical advances or something that change things, like, this is the best um quality of life I've been able to build for myself, and I've tried so many angles at this
Yeah, and
point.
it's a least side effects. I
Right,
mean,
exactly. I mean, that's a
I mean,
huge part of it.
like what? You might get tired if you're new. You might get the munchies if you're new to it. You might get, dry mouth or dry eyes or whatever. But I mean, it's nothing compared to you may experience a heart attack. If you get the shakes, then you're gonna have Parkinson's. I mean, it's like,
And it's
and it's getting back to nature. It's getting back to where we were disconnected.
well, yeah, it's about finding, it's sort of like the least harm principle, trying to find something that in the lowest dose with the least amount of side effects, that has got the best safety profile, um, to improve quality of life. And that's what I feel like I've done. And getting to what you want to get to next, cannabis is part of that, but psychedelics are also a part of that for me. Because I am someone that, generally at least once a year,
Hmm.
I like to have, a very mindful, planned,
Yes.
therapy session with psychedelics.